You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Adie Tomer from Brookings to talk about how transit-oriented development and active transportation play into climate strategies over the long term. We talk about mitigation versus adaptation strategies and what solutions work best for each. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues or more information about the annual conference live in Miami, go to railvolution.org. That's railvolution.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note with a cool stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. Still working on some new designs for scarves and some other cool merch, and looking forward to sharing those with you all soon when they're finished. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with Bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Today's podcast is brought to you by the 2022 National Shared Mobility Summit, hosted in person in Chicago, May 17th and 18th by the Shared Use Mobility Center. This year's theme, All Together Now, Collective Action for Shared Mobility. Attend the summit to interact with community leaders and innovative speakers, join interactive workshops and immersive field trips, the Mobility Justice Spotlight, and much, much more. Early bird tickets are available only for a limited time. Secure your seat today for SumC 2022 by going to summit.sharedusemobilitycenter.org. That's summit.sharedusemobilitycenter.org. Well, Adie Tomer, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Well, we've chatted a number of times, but perhaps you could tell the listeners a bit about yourself for those that might not be familiar.
Yeah, so I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. I work in our now formally branded Metro program. We used to call it the Metropolitan Policy Program, Center for Urban Studies or something at one point, but now we're just Brookings Metro. So I focus on infrastructure and built environment issues, working with my colleague Joe Kane on water and workforce, with my colleague Jenny Schutz on housing. You know, we got a whole kind of awesome team that's trying to think about how do we build more inclusive, sustainable, and competitive places.
What's the main focus right now? I mean, what's the most interesting thing that's happening out there that you see going on in the world?
Oh man, that's such a good question. There can't be just one answer. Look, I mean, Washington just passed, the biggest infrastructure bill of our lifetimes. So certainly you and me, Jeff, I mean, we've known each other for years and years, but this is the biggest one we'll see in our professional lives. What's going to happen with that? In particular, the implementation issues across the country are really top of mind for us. So that's a big one. And there almost isn't enough coverage we can give to it. It's going to touch every community. It's going to impact them in tons of different ways. And to give folks, because it's not the main thing we'll talk about today, if I can give one little nugget to folks to think about themselves too, it's, how is each region and state too, but more so at the regional and local level, going to be able to come up with the right kinds of matching funds to execute the projects they want? There's a ton of federal resources here, but it's going to require some skin in the game, to say nothing of winning competitive grants or convincing your state capital, right, to spend money the right way in your community that you want it, not how they want it. Those are hard fights too, but we got to come up with a lot more money on top of the money we've already spent. So there's some really difficult puzzles there. So we're working on that quite a bit. We have this really cool project going on in San Diego, which is just such an awesome place. And we'll be down there for about 5 years. And we're only about a half a year into it, to really think about what does it mean to build a more prosperous, inclusive, sustainable place, right? I'll keep kind of doing the 3 legs of the stool here. And to actually play that out in one market is really interesting. And then the other part, which is, I think, a big element of what we're, I think going to talk about today, is how do we actually deliver climate responsive solutions and not just the mitigation conversation, which we hear the most about nationally through switching to renewable energy sources or electric vehicles, but actually the adaptation conversation, which is, as you all know, out in California, right, Jeff, like your neck of the woods, the fires and the drought are constantly reminding us of that. But there's, other stressors across the country. And of course, every time a superstorm comes through, especially in the Gulf and up the Atlantic seaboard, it's a reminder. But the most recent one of the wildfires in, north of Denver and east of Boulder, just heartbreaking. I have a buddy who lost a home there, no joke. And it was so visceral and real. And yet at the same time, environmental scientists have been warning for years and years to not build there, that it was deeply unsafe. And our capital markets let us do it. So we are thinking a lot about what does it take to create a more adaptive kind of metropolitan development that recognizes the climate realities of where we are. Joe Kane and I just published this really wonky paper in case anyone's having trouble falling asleep at night. It'll help you with that. But it's also about how our capital markets are not set up right now to build these kind of places. They keep allowing housing to be built in the wrong places, the transportation to connect it. Like we're just not pricing stuff right. So, a big theme for us is how do we plan and deliver more resilient regions all across the country? We got a lot of work to do.
I look forward to reading that. Capital markets, insurance, regulations, all kinds of stuff. We've focused on that here in California because of the fires. And it's interesting to see what's happening and who's going to pull the strings on finishing building in the wildland urban interface.
Yeah. Did you see that recent piece in the Wall Street Journal about, I think it's AIG's pulling out of the California insurance market?
No, I didn't see that.
Oh, I highly recommend you and of course, listeners to check it out. There's this gentleman, and I might get it wrong, but I believe he's in Napa or just south of there, maybe Sonoma, talking about how he did everything he could to protect his house, but they just can't insure it. And the reality is it's because his house is under threat of wildfire. Like it's, the insurance market, it's not personal to them. It's always business. And they're just saying, I can't safely do this, right? Like, your house is really at risk. It's a great article. It really kind of paints in gray brushstrokes, it doesn't make it so black and white.
Right.
But it's a harsh reality we're living in right now.
Yeah. Well, so you were on a panel with our good friend Lucy Galbraith called TOD Critical Strategy for Fighting Climate Change at the Revolution Virtual Conference this fall. What was the first thing that came to your mind when you started putting together your presentation? Or maybe even when you picked the panel, what was the first thing that came to your mind about fighting climate change and TOD?
The first thing that really came to mind was I was excited to work with Lucy because she's awesome. So that was honest. She could ask me to just jump and I'd say how high, right? But the thought on the presentation itself was we need to be more sober in the transit supportive community. And I would argue the place-based community too. I don't think we have probably necessarily the exact same visions there as we probably do with the transportation investments, but I think we have pretty relatively common visions of the kind of communities we want to build. I don't think we're sober enough about what it's going to take to deliver more of those kinds of neighborhoods and corridors. And I was really excited for a chance to talk to a Railvolution audience where I'm often in the audience. Sometimes I present it too, because this was a cool kind of bi-directional conversation that Lucy and I crafted, and we really did it. So it wasn't just us talking at the panel. It was really these breakout groups, which was dope. The opportunity to push people to answer what should be hard questions, in particular around political economy, meaning, why do our communities not build what we are so convinced are right? What are we missing in that argument? Obviously a single presentation to a relatively small group is not going to move the needle, but we need to do a whole lot more of that, especially in the places we live. So it was a good experience to put together the presentation portion of that.
Do you think that TOD doesn't scale the way that we want it to at the moment? I mean, you kind of alluded to that, but it seems like it's not getting built fast enough to have an impact. There's a project here, there's a project there. That seems to be a bigger problem. And I don't want to use the terms and wordings of Silicon Valley. It drives me nuts. But, that I think it's just a good descriptor of how to kind of grow the pie.
Yeah, it's a great way to frame it, Jeff. Honestly, we're not getting scale. So it should push us to ask, why are we not getting it? What's the problem? One of the things I said in it was, we've won the marketing war. I mean, Jeff, this, they sell cars driving through cities right now.
Yeah.
Besides the danger of it all.
There's always a train in the background too, like they're driving by a light rail
totally.
or a streetcar.
Right. When they're filmed in like LA, they're near light rail, or Chicago, they like go through the loop,
Yeah.
Yeah, cities are so cool. We've won. Like, I mean, thank goodness we all get like food halls now everywhere, like they're wonderful, right? Obviously, I mean that, but yeah. So we've won the kind of visual and aesthetic fight. And so it's not like we're culturally losing, but yet to your point, we're not building enough of this stuff. And somewhere along the way, we've lost our ability to win the day in such a way that it doesn't each time need to be a massive fight, right? I think a lot about a community, let's say like Charlotte. The Blue Line has been so successful in terms of property investment. They get pretty low ridership. And yet still the development it just holds along that corridor right now, of course, on both sides of uptown. But yet they can't find enough money to build more of these corridors, right? The amount of density that they're trying to build in Charlotte, it's really impressive. They could do even more. But yet somehow the actual construction-based system, both on infrastructure and on housing and other real estate, it's just not built to let this thing flow on its own. Meanwhile, we know, as Lucy called it, I love it, the sprawl industrial complex. I mean, it's alive and kicking, right? And it's just so much easier to build that. And I don't think we're giving folks enough choice. We're not making the strong enough case for why, tight fitting neighborhoods, if you will, are advantageous. And we're definitely not taking advantage of how climate conscious TOD is, irrespective of the actual transit ridership part. So we got to keep working at, all these stupid cliches, right? But like, we got to stay in the lab or the workshop and keep working on this stuff. Cause we're not where we all want to be yet. Even if culturally, when Smart Growth launched, let's say, we're so much further along and have really done so well on that cultural front.
Well, that's a good question to kind of back up the topic at hand is why is TOD such a good climate change strategy? Why is it a better product, quote unquote product, than say the sprawl industrial complex produces?
I should talk definitions really quick. When I say TOD, I'm actually don't even care if there's transit there. I really just mean a walkable neighborhood. Like if you got a whole bunch of 4/1 apartments right down one common street, like that's TOD to me. Obviously, having fixed transit, and that whether that's fixed meaning that bus line's been there right for decades and they're not moving it, to of course rails or BRT in the road or in the right of way, great, of course, right? But we shouldn't be so transfixed, especially in the US, on the T part of it. So I'm talking walkable neighborhoods here. So the first great environmental thing that TOD neighborhoods deliver is significantly shorter trip distances. So based on a study that we're actually going to be expanding to 100 metro areas or 100 plus in the coming months, on a study we did of 6 metro areas, we found basically walkable TOD-like neighborhoods, their average trip mileage, this is again for all trips, was 4.4 miles. Now, relative context, that may not sound like anything. It's certainly beyond walking distance, but remember that's all those commute trips that are 10, 15 miles in a lot of places. In non-walkable places, the average trip mileage was 9.1 miles in many of those really suburban automobile-oriented neighborhoods. That's a huge difference. And if we want to hit our transportation emissions targets, we need to, I think, face the facts. That's really hard for most people in America who don't live, especially in many coastal or dense, kind of heartland markets. They can't get out of their car. They can't stop driving. They need it for even 50, if not 100% potentially of their key economic activities. So they're going to have a car. The best thing we can do is make sure they drive short distances and continue to make it attractive to them to use their bike, walk, use transit more of those trips. And shorter distances are going to do that. So that's the first benefit as like a categorical group. The second one, though, is that when you build those kind of neighborhoods, it has these other knock-on benefits too beyond transportation. So as one example, the stormwater runoff in denser development is 74% lower than in automobile-oriented development. Building out broadband networks can be 4x in savings, right? So that's just on water and broadband infrastructure. in general, we see huge efficiencies, and folks like Smart Growth America and folks have been, and a ton of academics have been running these studies for decades now. And we know it's extremely efficient on infrastructure, and in particular from an environmental perspective. It's part of the reason Europe kind of eats us right now on the place-based or metropolitan scale side of climate and carbon footprints, right, in particular, because they have more of these neighborhoods and more of the people that live in them. And we've got to figure out how to get folks living in more of those places while still somehow, making sure that it reflects American cultural values, from housing stock to, quality of life and things. I think we know that Americans like these neighborhoods too. We just don't have enough of them.
Yeah, I mean, the basic thing it feels like is just general street design. If you're going to build all those neighborhoods outside of the core, basic street design and, network design can make that simple. And there's a lot of cities that have done this where they've decided, no more cul-de-sacs, no more dendritic systems where the end is an end. It actually has to be networked. And it makes sense for a lot of different things. I mean, we had, Danny Pleasant on talking about how they, in Charlotte were thinking about the fire departments and their response times and what that means for, paying for fire response and how much that, saves them money over time and those types of things. So that seems to me like, aside from the development, it's a whole street network ideal that we need to kind of push and make sure that gets built, because we can't keep going the same direction that we were before.
Yeah, that's totally right. And it when you travel the country in particular. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, even though I work at Washington, D.C. And Cleveland's an older city, right? And we've got miles and miles of that kind of street cred you were just talking about, Jeff. And it's not that people don't live in the city of Cleveland anymore. It's just relative to its historic highs. I mean, it's at, I don't know the exact number. It's like, I'm saying it's roughly half below, like 50% below what its prior population peak was. It can fit a lot more people, right? And if you have them in there, they're going to benefit from that tighter street grid and how it impacts their behavior and how the city operates too. It's so much more efficient than other parts of the region. And I wish we could take more advantage of them.
I want to talk about the TOD strategy versus, say, like an auto electrification strategy. A lot of folks are pushing for electrification, EVs, as the way to get out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves and the way that we've built our communities with those roads we were just talking about. Why is it that folks are so focused on electrification when there's another strategy that actually has even more, like you said, knock-on effects?
This is where I get in the most trouble. I see.
It's not trouble if it's a good answer.
Yeah, no, man. I mean, look, I've got the receipts. I support dense development. I support it personally. In my personal choices, I support it in my work for 15 years. You can feel where this is going. I'm feeling defensive already. We need to get a lot more dense neighborhoods, whether it's like the example I just mentioned in Cleveland, just building up more, helping more people live in cities that have more of those neighborhoods, like the Clevelands and Milwaukee's and Buffalo's and Cincinnati's, et cetera, or even building up more in places like San Francisco that well. That's going to take a long time. And we don't have time right now, if we're to believe the climate modelers, which I do wholeheartedly. So we're in a really tricky spot. We need to somehow reduce emissions from transportation, which probably everyone who listens here knows that transportation is now the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions, by industrial sector, and it's going up while other areas are going down, which is a really bad sign, right? If you think about it, like we're figuring out renewables are not even at the scale we want, and it's already right from our energy generation sector, emissions are going down. Our building sector is actually getting, relatively speaking, more efficient energy-wise, and transportation, it just can't. It can't break through right now. So the tantalizing element of EVs is that if you clean up the electric grid, right, now immediately you're putting clean fuels into cars. Americans drive without having to change actual transportation behavior, meaning development behavior. We can get those reductions we need from the transportation sector. Again, the GHG reductions. That's not just tantalizing, it's correct. When you look at a purely mitigation standpoint, right? The problem is, as we just discussed, we know that our development patterns are unsustainable in a whole bunch of ways. Most critically, as we've seen with fires, particularly right in the Mountain West and out west, flooding in particular in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Northeast, and the Atlantic coast, our neighborhoods are under threat from increasing extreme weather events and even more kind of regular weather events like the king tides in Southeast Florida. We need to build more sustainably So we save money on infrastructure, like we were just talking about. So we have less stormwater runoff to keep our natural water resources cleaner. There's a whole bunch of arguments for it, but we don't have time to only use that intervention. Yet, if we invest in electric vehicles, how do we make sure that we still pause the automobility or the sprawl industrial complex again from continuing to gobble up more and more metropolitan land? And that is a complicated question to answer. It is not easy. And that's what we've got to focus on. I say we as a broadly defined, like folks who believe in this kind of spatial development. We've got about 5-10 years here where we really got to focus on how to win that day, knowing that because we're stuck with the development we built. So for the next few decades, most Americans are going to do most of their travel behavior by driving because they have to, because we're stuck with what we built in the past. So we're in a really tricky moment, and it's hard to live through it because it's like we're right in the middle of the fog, right? Or right in the middle of the forest, whichever metaphor you want to use.
Earlier on, you said mitigation versus adaptation. And so it seems like we're in this 10-year period where we're focusing on the mitigation of this specific thing. We're worried about lowering our emissions to 1990 levels to deal with the Kyoto and the Paris Accords. But over the long term of the planet and humankind, there does need to be that adaptation. And so ultimately, you can't fill the whole planet with vehicles. How do you reconcile those two? And because the vehicles have an inertia that will lead to more development that allows for, everybody will say, oh, well, no big deal. I'll live out here because I have my electric car. Whereas there's a whole issue with that from an ecology standpoint. How do you reconcile those two?
I don't. No, I mean, some existential kind of socioeconomic issues are true conundrums, right? We cannot have transportation emitting this level of greenhouse gases. And there is no metro area outside of New York that shows any kind of ability to get anywhere close to the kinds of reductions that we're really going to need. We could talk about what happens in this new kind of work from home, hopefully post-COVID environment, but the way we've, adapted digital tech for so many occupations. There's some other ways to get our miles traveled way down. But I mean, this stuff too, right? Like there's an absurd percentage of Americans, especially metropolitan Americans, but also remember small communities. I mean, they really are, right? It's low density by definition. I mean, things are just further apart. There's often an amazingly powerful, and I mean, as a compliment, Main Street, let's say, but housing can be miles apart, right? I mean, so those folks, transit is not what's going to work for them. It never has, right? It's ideally you can figure out solutions there, some stopgap, but it's right. It's not like New York City or San Francisco. And then most of the metropolitan residents live in automobility designed places. I mean, that's where the housing stock is. We've made our bet on this. It's not what probably almost anyone who listens to this wants, but these were decisions made by the prior generations. And I like to think they didn't know what was coming. Most of these folks, they just thought this was either cultural values or who knows, but that's what we got. And we're stuck with it. And we need to house people. And as we know from separate housing conversations, especially in our coastal markets, we don't have nearly enough housing inside TOD corridors and neighborhoods. So we've got some huge construction demands that's going to take 10 to 20 years to hit at a high note. I mean, you said it earlier too, Jeff, right? Like we're not getting scale on these corridors. There's too many one-off examples, right? Well, if we want to get everyone traveling much less and ideally getting out of their cars as often as possible, we haven't even started this, like the level of construction activity we need. And then by the way, that takes 10 to 20 years. There's so many great people out there who track transit investments and big real estate investments. They take 5 to 10 years sometimes, even once they do the proverbial groundbreaking, right, to the ribbon cutting. We just don't have that time. So to get back to the kind of that core part of the conundrum you brought up, that's right. We need to clean up transportation. The only short-term, meaning 10 plus years, but let's call it 10 to 20 year option we've got is electrifying a ton of the vehicle fleet, especially household fleet, because that's where the tech is, freight, long distance freight, especially shipping and air, like seaborne and air is even further away. So let's say we clean it up. We have to get rules in place now in communities that dissuades from the kind of continued investments in housing and low density commercial real estate and industrial investments on the metropolitan fringe. We have got to stop it in its tracks. And we just don't have much time left to do it. And we're going to probably have to go beyond just consumer taste, because we know folks want to live denser. People like townhomes and things, right? But we're going to need to figure out how to convince markets that it is too expensive to build what right now is far too cheap. So we've got to somehow mitigate and use the mitigation to adopt an adaptation strategy that inherently wants to retire the same mitigation strategy that'll save us. It's a real puzzle. And I am really open to other folks who are seeing it different and have evidence. I wish this was easier. I don't feel good seeing it this way, to be honest.
You mentioned capital markets earlier. Is there a way out? I mean, you say it doesn't look good, but theoretically, is there a way out? Is there a way to move towards a more walkable paradigm where you can get to those 4.4 miles per trip rather than 9.1 miles per trip?
This is where I'm so confident, Jeff. Joe and I did this work, and I in particular, but he did too. We kept having these neighborhood images in our minds of what are we building too much of, and the ones we're not building enough of, and which would be more sustainable. And we would sometimes ask these folks we'd interview. We did so many interviews, Joe in particular, to his credit. And a lot of folks working on the proverbial street, right? So these are either inside financial institutions, working at insurance firms, the ratings agencies, right? And consistently, right now, what the response would be, right now, it is too cheap to build the thing that you're saying we shouldn't have. And we agree, inevitably. So what we've got to get to, this is where we've been talking about scale a lot. And I think, again, I don't hear it as like a Silicon Valley thing.
Maybe it's because of where I am.
Yeah, I know, right? I think of scale more as actually it's like the suburban, that like cut and copy suburban neighborhood where, I grew up in Florida, someone who grew up in a version in California, you almost can't get further away from each other. We probably almost the exact spatial thing we grew up in, right? So that's scale. That's absurd amounts of scale. In fact, there's too much scale to it. So to scale these other ideas, you do that through capital markets. That forces people to make consistent amounts of decisions because we are a market-based economy. People like to make personal and then at their business private profit. And that's real. So how can you use those levers to our advantage? It's what we're hearing about constantly when these extreme weather events happen. And we just saw it in east of Boulder in Colorado. Folks, many really well-to-do folks in very expensive houses, the insurers came back. They had insurance, and the insurers came back saying, we're not going to cover your full cost. The actuarial folks, they know what's coming, and they would like us to start doing things differently. But right now, it's just we are not giving, in particular, private investors, whether they're households or other in commercial real estate, the right signals on where they should be investing. If we knew that the suburbs were more expensive, we couldn't hide costs in the same way we do right now, then folks would be much more attractive to invest in denser neighborhoods. So we've got to have these market signals work in our favor. To get there, we need to have a lot more climate-rich data. Places like Redfin should be applauded left and right, even if it's not the end of the story. And they're not done either, by the way, but where it is right now, knowing flood risk when you buy a house, that should be really, really clear even when you start searching. Knowing what your driving costs might be. And by the way, if we increase gas taxes or gas just gets more expensive, or we just have VMT fees, you should know what the average travel distance is in neighborhoods. That data is not available. It's not really clear. Walk Score is amazing, but that's not what Walk Score does, right? So we need a lot better data out there, and we need to help all of us who have money in either IRAs or all, right? I don't work in markets that way. So it's the money that we put away, we should be, if you want it to be truly investing in ESG, we can't have greenwashing on the built environment side. We need to actually make sure we're putting money in the right kinds of places and help underwriters like Bank of America and Wells Fargo, let's say, make it really clear to them that the right thing to do and the right profit motive actually, right, is more investment in the kinds of neighborhoods that we're interested in, right? Again, these walkable, TOD rich style neighborhoods.
I've been spending a lot of time chatting with folks that are maybe to the left of me, and maybe they've gotten in my head, but Because the discussion of markets and the markets that haven't worked for folks in, say, the Bay Area, young people who can't buy houses, those types of things, they come up as, quote unquote, neoliberal solutions. And I'm curious what a response to that would be, because there are people who are starting to be like, well, this system isn't working for me. I need to go and do a different system.
I would agree with them in many ways. Yeah. I mean, look, we lived in DC for a long time. I mean, it's not as bad as the Bay Area, right? But it's deeply unaffordable. It's fun to pack in a group home when you're 22, 25, right? To do work. But I'm sure most of those people would like their own kitchen if they could, like their own bathroom.
Yeah. Own bedroom.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's clear that the current situation isn't working. To me, there is no, in this space, unregulated market. Like, we have distorted markets in all kinds of ways through public policy. Sometimes it's good, oftentimes it's bad. And in particular in housing, it's been really, really bad. So my pushback would be, markets are not the problem. We all trade all day, every day, right, to get what we want. Like me, I'm talking like food, that's economy is everywhere. And so markets are not the problem. It's our lack of regulation or poor regulation, right? That is the problem. And we're not doing enough to construct housing, right? You've always had great pieces and study, housing stuff too, Jeff. Like, the Germanic model, like, they are market players, right? And big time global traders, if you will, not in capital markets. I'm saying, like, their manufacturing complex is enormous. They're just extremely successful. They have the absurd shares of public housing in some of those communities, like Vienna, what is often considered the nicest place to live in the world and very expensive, but public housing, like what is it? Well, north of 50%, right?
It's a lot.
So
yeah.
You see what I'm getting at? Like, we're not treating markets in favor of people in the US. And that's the real tragedy. We need to use profit motive to our advantage, right? And figure out how to do it in right ways that make sure we actually deliver. It's almost like a quality of life bill of rights, if you will, right? People have been talking about like universal mobility as a right, which is, something we've written about, even before folks were calling it that. I'm not saying, and people were writing about long before we did. I want to be clear. I'm not trying to say we invented anything. It's just, we need to make sure everything's accessible. Well, we haven't codified that. We haven't codified what affordable housing really looks like in all kinds of communities. And we certainly haven't codified what a environmentally resilient neighborhood looks like and how to help make sure then markets deliver it. Until you codify things, until you can make it measurable, markets can't work right. So I would argue we haven't set up the fundamentals right for what we want to achieve.
It's interesting when you kind of translate that to the recent infrastructure bill too, right? So we are wanting to do this mitigation of electric vehicles, right? So we're going to give electric vehicles a huge tax break. We're going to do all the chargers. We're going to spend billions of dollars on chargers. But here is the lowly electric bicycle, and you're going to give somebody $7,500 for a car. And here's these electric bicycles where you could get 4 of those and give them for that same amount of money that you're giving a tax break to somebody. You can give them for free. Obviously we need the electric vehicles. It's something that's necessary. And in order to change the paradigm of building electric cars for the car companies, you need to do something from an incentive perspective. But then you have all these other solutions, TOD, electric bikes, scooters, walkability. There's all these things. And so it's an interesting thing when you talk about codifying rules and laws when we just had a major codifying event.
I mean, aren't e-bikes just the best, dude? Like, they're the best. It is the most enjoyable transportation experience, I think, that exists. Outside of maybe something like, crazy gnarly, like, like riding like a moped through like the Italian hills or something.
You're going on Roman holiday.
Yeah, dude. Like, I'm sure there's so many folks who listen to stuff where you can remember not just the first time you got an e-bike, but in particular, it might not have been the first time, but like for me, it was the first time I got on a jump bike. And I was like, oh my gosh. And DC is not hilly like San Francisco, but like there's some elevation changes ever so slightly. I'm not sweaty. And I just did my normal bike ride, but like instead of like the super heavy capital bike share bikes, like this is the future of transportation. And obviously folks have been saying that for a while. I'm just parroting them. It is such a powerful technology. And I've been thinking about it, Jeff, why when we rehabilitate almost any road, or frankly, just on its face, just to think about restriping, right? Like when restriping needs to happen, why almost every major thoroughfare in America of any like level of density, where basically like biking could be safe if you put in the right protected bike lane infrastructure, that it just doesn't become a requirement. This is partly how, right, the Dutch and the Scandinavians achieve such high biking rates, right? It's same for London too. I mean, you've got to build the infrastructure, make it safe for people. The research on this is so good and so clear. And yet you're exactly right. We missed the opportunity to make it cheap. I'm not sure why we didn't do it. On top of the fact that so many of these bike manufacturers are doing work domestically, it's a really cool area, right, for relatively speaking, like small and mid-sized firms, the United States, to build up manufacturing expertise. Bike shop labor, I'm saying the bike shops that both sell and then of course maintenance locally, those are locally owned enterprises, right? That's actually keeping profit in your community. And so why we didn't invest big in this, I'm not saying we're going to regret because I'm such an optimist. I think it's so clear that this is going to be something, if we're successful in these next few years, which isn't going to be everywhere, but the places that win a ton of, let's say, the protect grants and raise grants and use formula money really well in combination with state and local, and get more people living in the kinds of neighborhoods that not just support transit, but support more bike infrastructure. I think there's going to be an even stronger case to be made. Like we've been fighting for however long, right, to try to get a bike credit along with, right, the transit and parking credit, and the federal tax code, that look, this is something we should be incentivizing because it's good for the environment. It's good for the American economy. And on top of it, you get the extra benefits of bike, even different than transit, certainly driving, the massive community health benefits of it. So I think, yeah, you're exactly right. The work is not done. It never is in Washington, but this is a real area we can benefit from. And I know I'm talking a lot, but this final quick point on it, 4.4 miles, that's too far to walk unless you really got a lot of time. Relative in transportation terms, dire straits, right? In which, we know about some of those well-known stories of folks who've had to walk that far. It can be often tough to take transit. The most common commute in America right now is, even if those distances, is suburb to suburb, right? So it's not like you're necessarily on a great transit corridor, but 4 miles on an e-bike, that's not long at all time-wise. And if it's safe, you're creating ideal conditions for someone, whether it's going on an errand or to go to work, right, to their bike. So we got to figure out how to tap into it. It's such an important way to unlock, again, those more sustainable and healthy transportation habits.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking that specifically is just because I look at that 4.4 number and I see e-bike potential, and and you look at the trip numbers for when they do the math and they do the research, they find that trip distances for the most part are fairly short, kind of like what you found as well. To get to the grocery store, to do that type of stuff. And an e-bike, can do that. I mean, I would love to use an e-bike around here, although our transit is good, our walking is good, so it's not a big deal. But tying that together with walkable community, tying that together with the TOD, tying that together with compact development, it seems like a win as well. And you don't need as much space to store things. You don't need as much room on the streets per se. I remember all these, wonderful pictures of Asian cities where people are cycling everywhere. I mean, I have a book on my shelf right now. It has like it's wonderfully quirky pictures of people on motorbikes in Vietnam and all of the things that they can carry on them, right? Like every page is something different. It's either 15 dogs or 10 boxes of ears of corn or whatever it is, but it's definitely something that can be done. The other thing along that same realm that I've been thinking about is infrastructure for the charging for vehicles, right? If you're in your own garage and you have your own space for your vehicle, that's not an issue. But if you're in a public street, if you're in a city in a walkable area, typically people in rental apartments aren't going to have a garage in some of those spaces. So Wednesday, for example, Kia Wilson had a piece in Streetsblog that kind of pushed back on a Wired piece the day before on charging infrastructure. I feel like there's been a bunch of breathless reporting like the Wired piece about charging infrastructure and where it would go and how city dwellers, what are they going to do if they don't have access to chargers? And I think Kia's point was that we aren't talking enough about the bus. We're not talking about active transportation, the e-bikes, those types of things. But I want to take that another step further and say maybe we don't need the access to chargers necessarily, but access for people overall. The chargers are something that we know that where they're going to go in the suburbs. But should we be focused on them in cities if we have all of these other ways of moving and accessing things? And I'm talking about urban cores. I'm not talking about suburbia or anything like that. I'm just thinking in places where we have active transport, where we have the bones already, we're having this discussion about chargers, but shouldn't it be about even more?
Key is great. As always, and that's a great way to set up the argument. What great story of with like when Seattle, in the before times now, but when Seattle was bucking everyone else's transit trend, how'd they do it? Well, people were moving to the core, and so they just took the bus more, like they were there. This is before, the massive ST3, right, or whatever. Like, they're not even close to done of what their mega transit investments are going to be. So we know that just people living in the core sets this up. There's a few arguments for having chargers around in the urban core. People are still going to drive anyways. You really want to make sure, especially if you have aggressive GHG targets in your cities, unless you're going to ban cars everywhere, which I don't think folks are proposing outside of, we have to see how these plans, let's say in like places like Berlin, end up playing out. But the US, because so many people live so far from the core, when they go through, whether it's right for work or right, like a nighttime activity or something, like going out to dinner or seeing a show or something, they're probably traveling in a car. And to make sure that they're comfortable and that you get those reduced, again, short-term emissions, you want your marketplace comfortable investing in electric vehicles. Overall, at the scale of investments we make in transportation, and I should stress to everyone, by the time this probably runs, we're going to be launching a massive infrastructure bill interactive on our website. So it's obviously a shameless kind of plug for it. But you can go on there and see the amount of stuff that's electric vehicle, like battery, like actual charging related. Even within this bill, it's such a small part, right? And then of like the annual spending on transportation infrastructure in this country, it is tiny, tiny, tiny. So I don't even think the charging investments we make right now, frankly, are going to last very long. What's more likely to last is just the local distribution network, right, of the electric grid, like backbone investments that might be made in those corridors. We'll have to make future charging investments anyways. We're not even close to done yet. And so I think they're really important, yet Kia's point is not only well taken, the real focus needs to be on those elements are going to happen because there are so many powers that be that want the electric vehicles done. What we've got to do is continue to figure out how to get more development in dense places because folks in general are going to just, on the long run, be demanding less of that charging infrastructure in the future, hopefully.
How do you get more people in dense places? One of the interesting things that we found when I was at RA was we did some work with CNT and we looked at, we had a database of every station in the United States. And for, I believe it was a report, maybe like 2013 or 2012 or something like that, we found that if you put people in the areas with lower VMT already, they would kind of adopt that profile rather than if you put a dense development on a commuter rail station outside of a core. And so getting people to move into those places seems paramount to getting what you need because they'll start adopting the VMT profile of that place rather than trying to get people to adopt a lower VMT profile in a place that doesn't have it. I'm curious how you get to that. We were talking about scale earlier. Like, how do you just kind of move that forward for a walkable development in cities, even coming up against the opposition, NIMBYs, et cetera, that we are now? And maybe it's thinking about smaller cities and smaller towns and people moving there. I don't ever want to, say that you can't live in San Francisco because I'd love for that to happen, but our board of supervisors at the moment makes it really hard for people to move here.
That's right. I humbly think this is an area we need a ton more research. And I mentioned earlier, it's got to be focused on political economy. I don't think we're lacking for solutions that are on the proverbial shelf. We know which binder they're in, to clumsily extend this metaphor. We know what binder they're in. We know what the list is. Too often, folks are scared to change the status quo. Entrenched interests, right, will fight for what they're currently probably profiting off of. I think there's an obvious basket of goods here, which I'm not saying anything folks don't already think about, right? How do you make it more expensive to build automobility-based infrastructure, right? We're seeing it right now. Like the climate is moving in our direction, the cultural climate, where it's getting a lot harder to widen roads. It's getting a lot harder to make the argument for it. That's really helpful, including even just stalling projects, right? Like stalling is okay because as things can change before you know it, a project may not be sensible anymore. I mean, this is for folks who are following it. This is part of the I-5 debate in Portland right now, right? Which just changed in the past week. How do you change your zoning laws, right? What kind of anchor developments do you want to promote? And when I say anchor developments, I mentioned earlier too, it's like, a market hall. Like, should the public sector potentially be investing in something like that? doing it in a way that promotes local entrepreneurs from the neighborhood and makes sure that it's tied with affordable housing, but like goes to a place where right now too many folks are leaving for whatever reason for certain kinds of retail, including food retail. That's what I'm getting at. Like, how do you do that kind of element so you get development around it? Then how do we get all of the pricing right, in particular on real estate development? And then how do you kind of align these systems across the region? That's kind of 5 buckets that I'm thinking about. But in each one, I don't think, again, we're lacking for technical solutions. I think we're lacking a clear menu on how you respond to the current political dynamics in any place around those interventions. Who are you opposed? Who's with you? What groups are a toss-up? Where is there an information deficit? How do you make sure to compensate the losers, right? This is classic kind of negotiations in a truly like lowercase d democratic system. Like, we've got to figure out how to win the day with the powers that be. And I don't think we're there yet. The positive side, whether it's just going up in places like San Francisco or back to like the Cleveland example of like, there's all these great urban bones you can fill in. It's not like we don't have the places to invest. We just got to figure out how to kind of crack the code on getting it done.
How has the pandemic impacted all these discussions? I mean, obviously it's changed the thinking of people who maybe before said there's no way ever that you'll ever be able to work at home for professionals, right? There's a lot of people that have no opportunity to work at home, obviously, and I don't want to leave them out, but there's a high percentage of people that are able to work from home now that maybe weren't before, just because of political, and I'm not saying political like government political, I'm thinking like internal company politics to a certain extent. That changed the paradigm for a lot of people. So, what does the pandemic mean from a politics standpoint from that, not government necessarily, but also, how is that impacting our discussion about new solutions for getting people into TOD, into compact development, lowering VMT, all those things?
I'm weirdly bullish on what COVID is going to do for our cities in the long run. My fundamental belief on this is that it's not just that cities are eternal, it's that humans really, really like to socialize with one another, and actually to do it with like a physical proximity. That video just can only do so much. Now, far beyond me to be able to predict, right, how much remote work we're going to have in the future. If I had to make a bet, I'd say I think we're going to get a whole lot more people working from home, like 3 days a week. We'll figure out some kind of system culturally that's probably all over the map, depending on the employer. And 2 days in, we're all together. 2 days in, just pick whatever days you're there, and whoever's there is there. I think there'll be a certain amount of people that move out of the metropolitan areas where they work. It'll be more flexible, but I don't think it'll be such a huge portion. Like I can't even name a number, but way below the majority of, again, the kind of workers who are in jobs who even can do that, right? Put aside folks like nursing and things that like have to be in, which are huge job teaching, right? That need to be in physical proximity. So I think we'll telecommute more, but what we already know from past data on telecommute habits is that oftentimes people end up taking other trips more than they did before. And they often look to stay within their adjacent neighborhoods, maybe their exact one, right, or the one surrounding. Now, that gets us right back to the whole conversation we've been having tonight, Jeff, right? Of, well, what's the design of the neighborhoods where you live then, right? Is adjacent neighborhood like, from one end of yours to the end of the other one is like 10 miles, right? Like in the suburbs, or is it you like in a city where it's half a mile, you've crossed into like 2 named neighborhoods, you know what I mean? Like it really depends. And what we are going to need to, again, back to the kind of how market signals, again, lowercase m, but like influence where people decide to be, and how cultural signals influence where people want to be. It's an ideal opportunity to invest at the neighborhood scale, to say, look, like you're going to be spending even more time in your home neighborhood. That's great. Let's make sure the quality of life reflects what people want. Let's make sure that we've got public civic space amenities, right? Let's make sure that we've got all the array of retail that folks need just every day, right? I'm not talking like shopping for clothes necessarily. I mean like day-to-day retail that folks need. And then that gives us the opportunity to also rethink, how do we connect those neighborhoods and how do people move between them? We're going to see some fascinating changes in people's travel habits. And it might finally break, something that we've been so focused on in the US, where it's We built transit around commuting habits. Commuting habits change. These are over a century, right? Then commuting habits changed to reflect the suburb to suburb connections of where people lived and where they worked. But if all of a sudden that breaks, we might finally recognize that we can design our transportation habits around the majority of trips that people make, which are non-commuting. And especially, they may not be commuting at all nearly as frequently. And that's a game changer. Real estate folks, and you talk to some too, like, I can't wait. I'm just collecting ideas. I don't know, like, can we repurpose office space? What do we do with all of this, like Class A office? I mean, that is a whole different issue, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking more through the scale of neighborhood level transportation and local non-commuting travel habits. That is the really interesting one to watch. And to kind of close up on my side on this one, it is really important that applied researchers, whether in academia, outside of it, are finding where those travel habits look the way we want them to from a sustainability and kind of inclusive standpoint. What and how did those either cities or metropolitan areas achieve it? Did they change anything? Was it just the nature of their dynamics they already had going into this? I mean, I'm basically saying folks are going to need to find best practices here, but the best practice might not actually be anything. It's just actually a change of behavior and trying to figure out why that happened.
Last question. US DOT released a strategy for safer streets, basically, safer roads. I don't know if that's the exact name, but we'll go with it. And they put together, a list of things that they want to accomplish. This is just kind of the start of the discussion. They obviously need state and local DOTs and transportation agencies and other folks to get on board. From a TOD perspective, I'm wondering if you had the chance to write a similar strategy to get more compact development, how would that look? Or what would be the first step?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, I tick through a couple things. Number one, you got to be really clear on the audience, and in particular, who are the most influential folks. What are you trying to communicate to consumers, and what do consumers want? What are you trying to communicate to businesses? What do they want? And then government practitioners, where are they having trouble? I would think about what are your marketing techniques for what you're going to develop. Then your geography, and you mentioned this earlier too, Jeff, in your past work. Are you looking to change what happens on the fringe in terms of creating more TOD there, or are you looking to activate places that have maybe already been developed? And then I mentioned earlier those kind of 5 buckets of policy. Based on kind of partially your answer on those, you got to create a menu of options for folks to explore. Every transportation and neighborhood system is unique in every place. There are no cookie cutter solutions. There can be cookie cutter engineering designs, right? Like a protected bike lane can theoretically work anywhere. It's certainly designed that way. But the political dynamics of getting it on any specific corridor are going to be different. So we got to make it easier for practitioners to know what their options are. But again, my first part of this answer, I hope it makes sense, is it's less about the specific design techniques as how do we convince people and steer them and sell them on the importance of this idea to protect the planet and people and create economic value, make more competitive businesses. There's so much on the side of this. I don't think we have the right, it's not like the tools, it's like the manual on how to use them, if that makes sense. Like we've got to better explain to folks how to get that done. I think the spirit behind what the DOT just did with safety speaks to that, right? Like the culture's behind this. We're going to change some of our techniques, but they even talked about it. It's state and locals control a lot of this. So they're going to have to figure out those kind of partnerships. We're going to need to do the same on a TOD strategy. And again, the feds in this administration, I'm sure, like meaning in a good way, they will want to lead here and can do a lot. This is up to every community. They control their land use, right? They control the vast majority of their local street infrastructure. They can change things quickly, but they need to make sure their business community and residents are behind it.
Sounds like an organizing task for all of us.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it more and more that way these days. And especially from a research perspective, I mean, right, Jeff, you and I have known each other for years, and like the kind of stuff we love to do, like what's the kind of like power stats that need to be created, right, to help win arguments? Like that's where a lot of the work I think needs to be done at this point, because again, engineers, architects, planners, they have so much good work that we're not even putting to use yet on the shelf. Doesn't mean they shouldn't keep innovating too. I'm saying I feel like we're letting them down, right? the practitioners and applied researchers, we got to figure out how to break through with their great ideas.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, Adie, where can folks find you if they want to take a look at some of your work?
You can always find me, like the work our team does at Brookings Metro, or just go to brookings.edu or just search for us in your web browser. You'll find our stuff. We're around. Honestly, you can drop me a line there too. Not only what you think about this, but stuff you want us to look into, cool case studies, let us know. We always want to hear from folks.
Awesome. Well, Adie, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, always great to talk with you, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.